Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the album from Mike and Rich, Expert Knob Twiddlers. Mike and Rich are, as you may guess, Mike Paradinas and Richard James, that is to say, mh-Ziq and Aphex Twin. And yes, before you ask, I know it's actually pronounced mh-Ziq and not mh-Ziq, but I use the latter pronunciation to avoid confusion. A collaboration album between two IDM heavyweights, one of which I really wish got the recognition he deserves. Sounds like something out of this world. Although, let's just say most people were not expecting this. This album originally dropped in 1996, but it was re-released with a bunch of bonus tracks yesterday to celebrate its 20th anniversary. As such, since I've already covered Aphex Twin in great detail over the course of several videos, may as well add one more video to the collection. I'll be honest though, I've always associated this album more with mh-Ziq than I have with Aphex Twin. Thanks to the fact that it has a lot more jazz overtones, something that definitely plays more to Mike's style than RDJ's. Although, it does mesh their styles pretty well. In fact, it's very difficult to determine who exactly contributed what on this album. A big part of this is that the album is not played seriously in any capacity. It's basically a complete joke of an album. The idea of a jazzier IDM album is more characteristic of Paradinas, though an entire album played almost entirely for laughs is more like something RDJ would do. Just look at songs of his like Logan Rockwitch or Milkman. Actually, this came out the same year as Richard D. James' album, so yeah, that would make sense. I read somewhere that RDJ and Paradinas were actually trying to imitate each other on this album, so who does what is anyone's guess. Maybe they were making fun of each other, who knows. On top of that, it's especially weird in both their catalogs is there's a lot more samples in this album than either artist usually uses. They seem to be in part inspired by like ad jingles and that kind of stuff. Yes, when I say this album is basically a joke, I don't mean in that it's like made to be terrible on purpose or something like that. I mean it's absurdly silly and lighthearted, as you might guess given the board game album cover, which, by the way, is one of the best album covers I've ever seen. Or song titles like Mr. Frosty, Giant Deflating Football, Eggy Toast, Upright Kangaroo, etc. Mike implies in the Bandcamp description that they might have literally been drunk while composing some of these songs. So, obviously it is a weird album. It's a silly album. It's a very lighthearted and nonsensical album. But is it a good album? Yes, absolutely. Through all the ridiculous sounds and ideas, there's a lot of great melodies all over the place, and the usual attention to detail you'd expect out of these two. One that's a lot smarter than it actually lets on. Sure, you do occasionally get a track that's really repetitive and doesn't progress much, but the majority of these tracks actually are very interesting and provide a much more engaging, in-depth listening experience than you'd expect. I'll go down track by track, but before I do that, I'd like to mention the reissue changes the track order slightly. To be honest, I didn't think there was anything particularly wrong with the original track order, but by the same token, I don't think the changes left had that big an impact on the album as a whole. It wasn't one where the track order seemed to particularly matter that much. The only major change I can think of was moving the track Reg to track number 2, and given that that was definitely one of the better tracks, I'd say that was a good thing. A few others got shifted around, but I'd say it didn't really affect the album that much. In the meantime, I'm just going to go by the reissue's track order. Anyway, the opener, Mr. Frosty, is a much more synth-driven track, with lots of synth clavinets all over the place, giving it a touch of a 70s soundtrack or TV opening kind of vibe, and lots of extra Blade Runner-y synth pads running around as well for texture. All the while there's a simplistic bass line and a lighthearted beat tying everything together. There's even a handful of solos here and there for some extra flavor. Definitely a memorable opening. Reg, meanwhile, is more of a sample-based track, starting right out with a repetitive sample of some kind of surf rock tune, bringing in some silly voice sample. xylophones, and even some whistling for good measure, because why the heck not? But there's also some synth melody side tracks in there too. It's a particularly busy track with a lot going on, but it's a ton of fun all the way through. The sheer density of a lot of Paradina's tracks is one of the things that makes him so fun to listen to, and this track shows a good example of that kind of structured craziness. Jellyfish takes a repetitive sample out of some kind of late 60s TV series, and just takes it all over the place, adding in layers of beats and weird synth melodies. Eggy Toast is laid out in largely the same way as Jellyfish, although I prefer this track, as the sample is a little longer and gives the track an odd time signature, making it more memorable. There's even a little synth riff in this track that kind of reminds me of Boards of Canada, but whatever. Vodka is next, and to be honest, this one isn't a huge favorite, though it's still a good one to be sure. It is probably the most normal / characteristic of Paradinas and RDJ on this album, but of course that's not saying much. The melodies are very spooky sounding, like a drunk version of Ictedral or some random track from Tango Invective. Winner Take All is a little more back down the lighthearted pathways the earlier tracks took. It's pretty repetitive, based mostly around a loop of some xylophone pattern that could have been the soundtrack to someone sneaking around at night in a kids show, but it's still definitely enjoyable. It gets pretty spooky near the end, as well as with some weirdly dissonant synth pads layered on top of everything. Upright Kangaroo is another odd track, characterized by a lot of sound effects that sound like synthesized burping and farting. Or maybe they're not synthesized, but yeah, definitely burping and farting is on here. The actual melody to this track isn't one of the more memorable ones, to be honest, but still a pretty good track nonetheless, and not one you're likely to forget. I'm a little less enthusiastic over Giant Deflating Football, which is a bit too repetitive for its own good without having that much progression. The samples are definitely fun and give it this weird, lumpy awkwardness that's kind of charming in its own way, but not much happens over the course of its 6-minute length. I mean, it could be a lot worse, and it somehow hasn't gotten insufferable with repeat listens, but it's definitely not one of the tracks that I super look forward to whenever listening to this album. But thankfully right after that, we get the sound of Beady Eyes, probably the funkiest of all the tracks on here. The synth clavinets from Mr. Frosty come back in a big way, and while this isn't as hard-hitting as that track, it's no less fun to listen to thanks to a lot of synth solos. Kinda remind me of listening to a small section of Manuel Gosching's E2-E4 in some parts. But it also actually has a sense of progression to it, too, and it feels like it's actually going somewhere, much like Reg. This track is a standout, to be sure. But at the end, we finish off with the most laid back in the whole track listing. It starts out simple with another repetitive voice sample, kinda sorta saying the title, combined with some tranquil electric piano loops, and a beat that's almost non-existent, but still moves things along at a slow pace. But other slow but fun lo-fi samples and spooky synth melodies almost out of Kraftwerk's Trans-Europe Express are stacked on top to make things interesting as well. Oh, and whistling too, because why not? It's a slow track, but it's definitely a fun and interesting one that I think closes the album out on a good note. But the reissue also tacks on a bunch of bonus tracks as well, so I suppose I should discuss those briefly. Now, 3 of the bonus tracks are just alternate versions of songs from the main album, being Vodka, Jellyfish, and Upright Kangaroo, and to be honest, I don't think any of them are like big improvements over the originals. I suppose the new Upright Kangaroo mix has an intensity to it that the original didn't have, but that track isn't even on the CD version, so I guess it doesn't matter that much, unfortunately. The other tracks vary in quality, and some probably would have felt a little out of place here. For instance, the track Brivert and Muons would have been better suited to micro-Ziq's In Pine Effect album or something, but they are all fairly enjoyable. Portamento Gosh and Clissold Bathroom are kinda over too quickly to leave a strong impression, but Waltz and Organ Plotter I can see fitting among this album pretty well. So, overall, is Expert Knob Twiddlers worth your time? Yes. definitely. Sure, it's not very serious at all, but even at this album's worst, it's still enjoyable all the way through. It's a worthy addition to the catalogs of both Aphex Twin and mh-Ziq, bringing in some of their best melodies. And let's face it, had they actually tried for something serious with this album, it probably wouldn't have been quite as well remembered. This isn't an album to be missed or forgotten. Definitely check it out at some point. I am overall feeling an 8.3 out of 10. Favorites and least favorites in the description. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I would like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.